I trust everybody. So we're talking about Jewish people, and there's got to be an answer as to why there are so many people dislike them. What's wrong with Jewish people? Do they have 3 eyes, or 2 noses, or 4 ears? Or what's going on with these guys? And how can you tell the difference between somebody who's Jewish and somebody who's not?
I wouldn't tell.
So how do you know who to kill? Wow, this is a tough one. Every time I ask you guys this, you've got no answer for me. Why did Hitler hate Jews? What's the reason? What's wrong? Christians hate Jews. Or at least some Christians hate Jews. It seems to be a Christian thing.
Maybe it's because of the biblical stories.
Okay, what is the biblical story?
Jesus.
Jesus, I remember that one.
And he's a Jew, right?
Yeah.
And then, but the pharaohs are Jews too, so they clash and they might get against each other's, but it's all biblical stories.
So does that make us hate Jews? I mean, if we're Christian, do we hate Jews? Is that automatic? It's right there in the Bible. It says hate Jews. Is it in there? Have I misread the Bible? There's got to be a reason.
Because I think that religion is hard to talk about too.
Sure it is.
Even on Navajo or different...
Traditions?
yeah, the tradition, the NAC, and then Christianity. So
Sure.
Religion is really hard to talk about.
Sure it is. Of course it is. That's why we have to talk about it. It's part of psychology. It's part of the hate in the United States. It's part of the hate around the world.
Yeah.
So that's why we have to figure it out. We need to understand this. I mean, otherwise things happen. We have no clue. We're going, I don't understand. Why are Sunni Muslims killing Shiite Muslims? Why are Shiite Muslims blowing up Sunni mosques? What's going on? Who's doing this? What's going on here? Have you ever heard of the Sikhs in India? They're kind of a splinter group of the Hindus. They're real tall. And they always wear a turban. They always have to carry a knife. They're really interesting people. Anyway, so the Sikhs and the Hindus sometimes come to blows to the extent that it was Sikhs that assassinated Indira Gandhi, the first female prime minister of India. They assassinated her. And then, of course, they had wars going on. But over the weekend, a man went into a synagogue, hates Jews, hates them, despises them, wants them all to die. Went in and shot and killed 11 people. One of the persons that he shot and killed was 97 years old. But she was Jewish, so she was primed to be killed because she was Jewish. So why did he hate Jews?
What was his nationality, the shooter?
Pittsburgh. White American. I got bad news for you. On Friday, a man went into a Kroger, tried to break into a black church, but the church was closed and the doors were locked, couldn't get in. So he went over to a Kroger and started shooting at black people because he hated black people. Killed 2. One was 69 years old, my age. He was there with his grandson. And he shot the man in the head, killed him. And the grandson went screaming out of the store. Then he found a 67-year-old black woman and shot her. And then he surrendered to the police. On Thursday, we caught the bomber, the guy that was sending pipe bombs to Democrats. So Thursday, we had this assault on Democrats, On Friday, we had an assault on black people in Louisville, Kentucky. And then on Saturday, we had an assault on Jewish people in Pittsburgh. I know. All of the shooters and the bomber were all white. The bomber was half Filipino. So what's going on?
I heard a comment, I'm not sure exactly who made it, but during all this shooting that took place,
Yeah.
that comment was, they're white people that done the shooting, so they get nothing. They let them slide. They're gonna let them slide.
Slide? I don't know how they're gonna slide. We're gonna put them someplace where we can't let them go. Can we?
But I think the justice system is good because if you do wrong, it goes through courts and,
Right.
yeah, that's what I thought when that was said.
Well, we've got what? We've got 13 dead people and 12 bombs that never went off that targeted Democrats. So it looks like we've got some real angry white guys wandering around the United States doing horrible things to people. Now the good thing is we captured all 3 of them. None of them are dead. One of the guy that shot up the synagogue is wounded. Was wounded by the police. Shot several times. But the funny thing was, guess where they sent him? It's not that funny, I guess. They sent him to a Jewish hospital. They sent him to a Jewish hospital. So the people that saved his life were Jewish. The nurses and the doctors were all Jewish. Which is kind of, not that funny, I guess. It's kind of interesting. So what's going on with all this hate flying around the United States? What in the world's going on? I mean, they sent a bomb to the headquarters of CNN in New York City. They tried to kill, they had a bomb sent to former CIA heads of the CIA. Both of these guys had worked under both Republican and Democratic presidents. But they didn't like him because they said bad things about Donald Trump.
I think it seems like the nation's kind of growing. It's just like all this hate just coming to the top.
Where's it come from?
I don't know if your leaders and your speakers.
Okay. Who are these leaders and speakers that we need to look at?
I would say the one that's mostly in the media, going grabs more attention.
Who are we talking about?
Well,
Give me a name. Don't tiptoe around the damn subject. Tell me what you're talking about.
I would say Donald Trump,
He seems to say really negative things about it.
but then it's election year, so
It is an election year, but he's not running.
everyone's name calling, pointing fingers.
We do get a lot of name calling. So what we have to do is figure out what's true and what's not true. We get a lot of lies. You remember the story about Hillary and Bill Clinton having a child trafficking, running a child trafficking business out of a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. You know, that's just ridiculous. It's the silliest thing that we've ever heard. But people believed it because they wanted to believe it.
I think he has a point with elections and you know how elections they all these emotions and all these pointing fingers and you know it's like that's part where people listen, they take the attention of it. You know, it can like muster up people inside, especially unfortunately some of the wrong people. They got that, you know.
We have a lot of people that don't care about politics. And some of you may be right here in this room. Care less whether they're red or blue or Democrat or Republican. Right?
I get involved at times. Look, just want to know what's going on out there with politics.
Sure.
And I like to know, and I update myself about what's happening. But my husband, no clue. He does not want to know.
Just want to know, that's the last thing in the world he cares about.
Yeah.
Until people start shooting each other. Now we got a much more serious situation, because there's dead people in Pittsburgh and there's dead people in Louisville. And the reason they're dead is because of their minority status. The people in Pittsburgh are dead because they're Jewish, and they were at synagogue. Well, the reason they were at synagogue is because it's Shabbat. It's a holy day for Jewish people. They're supposed to go to synagogue. And they were there, and he went in, and he had an AR-15 and a bunch of Glock pistols in his belt, and lots of ammunition. But luckily they were able to stop him before he killed everybody. He only killed 11 people. I guess that's enough, isn't it? Or maybe that's too much. Anyway, a lot of hate going on in the United States right now. So they were talking about gun control. One of the things they talk about every time one of these shootings takes place, here we had 2 of them in the same weekend. They always talk about gun control, and of course the people that are in favor of everybody having a weapon, they talk about mental illness. Oh no, all these people are crazy. Well, maybe that's true. But one of the reasons that these people are out on the street is because of deinstitutionalization. This happened under the Reagan administration in 1982. He deinstitutionalized. He closed all these state hospitals. There's only one federal mental hospital, and that is in Washington, D.C., St. Elizabeth's. St. Elizabeth's is huge, and they have just a handful of people in there now. But they deinstitutionalized the mental hospitals. And because they did that, they released all these people out into the street. So where were they going to go? Well, now they get their medication from outpatient clinics, but sometimes it's not enough. If you've ever been around somebody that's schizophrenic, they're very difficult to be around because they have such strange ideas. A lot of times, especially if they're paranoid schizophrenic, they don't want to be around you either because they don't trust you. They don't trust anybody. They have a difficult time trusting people, let me say that. So a lot of times they just leave, or you kick them out because you can't stand. It's driving everybody crazy. The whole family is suffering because of this one individual. As a result, the mentally ill have experienced higher rates of homelessness, unemployment, alcohol and drug use, and unfortunately physical and sexual abuse. They also experience high rates of incarceration. However, most local jails lack treatment resources, so what can they do? All they can do is incarcerate them and then release them. There's nothing else they can do. They can't treat them because that's not their job. And of course, people are being, they're cutting funding for all of these things, and so the police departments just can't handle it. And sometimes they have too many people in their jails anyway. So are they going to release the rapist, or are they going to release the homeless crazy person? Who are they going to release first? The person with a mental illness they're going to release first, because they certainly don't want to release a rapist or a thief or a murderer. They don't want to release those individuals, so they release the person with mental illness. What are they holding for anyway? Well, it's usually vagrancy. Vagrancy, they can hold you in jail for a number of days, maybe a month, but then they have to release you. So what do? They just let them go. According to the criminalization hypothesis, a subset of mentally ill offenders committed and were arrested for offenses caused by their untreated symptoms of mental illness. And of course, that's why they keep committing crimes. Mental health courts were developed to decriminalize this population. So the idea was we have a lot of individuals out there who are homeless. They keep committing these minor crimes like vagrancy, like petty theft, and instead of incarcerating them for a short period of time and making them worse, what we need to do is we need to see these individuals in mental health courts, and maybe we can actually find resources to help them. That was the idea. If the offender is diverted, the mental health team prepares a treatment plan to lead to a long-term psychiatric care and reintegration into society. Now, I don't want to tell you that all of the people working with this are altruistic, and that's the reason they're doing it. A lot of them are doing it to make money, unfortunately. Sometimes good ideas turn into lucrative ideas, and then somebody who just wants to make money gets a hold of it, and all of a sudden they're making bigger and bigger piles of cash. So that kind of thing happens, and we have to accept that. That's what they're arguing about in New Mexico right now. The lady that's running for governor used to run a healthcare organization.
Michelle Lujan Grisham.
Yes. And the Republicans are claiming that she ripped off everybody. She made millions and millions of dollars, and she got all these strange contracts. That's what the Republicans are saying. And the Democrats are saying, no, she didn't. She was a good person. She didn't start out to make money. She just turned out that way. So we've got a lot of people arguing back and forth. And it's an ugly argument because the Republicans are saying really, really not very nice things about her. And she's trying to defend herself. It's really kind of interesting to watch. Or not interesting to watch. The other guy that's running, the Republican that's running, Pierce, is really kind of an interesting guy because he hasn't been in New Mexico for a while. He's been in Congress. And so he's been in Washington, D.C. So it's really interesting to watch him walking around New Mexico with his starched white shirt on and his leather shoes. So it's just really kind of interesting. We'll see who wins, whether she wins or whether he wins. Evaluations of mental health courts suggest that they have been moderately effective in linking individuals to treatment services and in reducing recidivism as long as the full dose of treatment is provided. Of course, the biggest problem with mental health is that the people don't go completely through their treatment. A lot of times, as soon as they start feeling better, they leave. This is very common, especially with people suffering from psychosis. Individuals suffering from schizophrenia, as soon as they start on their medication, they start feeling better, so they think that they can stop taking their medication, and then they get worse, of course. Same way with bipolar disorder. These individuals are suffering through depression and manic phases. Well, they don't mind the manic phase because it feels too good. It's like being on speed, but when they're in their depressive stage, they want somebody to fix them. So as soon as they come out of their depressive phase, a lot of times they'll go off their medication. And now we got a problem. If you can imagine being mentally ill, and I don't really want you to imagine being mentally ill, but the reality is that when people are mentally ill, they don't recognize the fact that they're sick, unless it's depression. Anxiety, everybody thinks that, don't they? And the answer is no. Your anxiety is a little bit worse than other people's. No, we're not overly anxious. Now this gets kind of interesting because who's going to buy a gun? Who's going to buy a pistol? Who wants to protect themselves? The guy that shot up the synagogue was on a website called Gab Guns, where people showed off their gun collections. And he showed off his. He had a collection of Glocks. Glocks are very expensive weapons, and he had 4. And he was armed with 2 when he went into the synagogue. He had an AR-15, which is a military weapon. So who's going to arm themselves? Who's the most likely person to arm themselves? I have this argument all the time. I don't have a gun. I'm not armed. I'm not dangerous. I'm probably, maybe depressed.
How about the mentally ill?
Somebody that is overly anxious? Yeah, that's mental. mentally ill. The problem is that if you're afraid of life, if you're afraid of something out there, you're going to buy yourself a gun. Well, maybe your fear is real, maybe your fear isn't real. I have a friend that, oh, I told you about this guy. He's got 18,000 rounds of ammunition. He switches out. I mean, ammunition doesn't last forever, so he switches some out every year. He spends his money on new guns. And I asked him, he lives in my old hometown. I asked him, why in the world do you need a gun? And he says, it's dangerous out there. Well, who might attack you? This guy's got more guns. Well, he's got 18,000 rounds of ammunition. Is he expecting the Russians to attack? Who's going to attack him? He lives in a gated community. He lives behind a fence. Not one fence. There's a fence around the entire development, and then he's got a fence around his own property. Who's the most dangerous person? Are there black people that want his stuff? Are there Jewish people that want to take all of his money away from him? Why is he so scared? And what is he scared of? And if he's scared, why am I not scared? What's wrong with me? Which one of us is mentally ill? The guy with 18,000 rounds of ammunition, all the newest weapons in the world, who lives in a gated community behind a second fence? Which one of us is mentally ill? I don't even lock my car. So if you want to get into my house, the back door is open. It's just in case anybody's got it. Which one of us is crazy? Him or me?
Him. That's subjective.
Why not me? I'm different from everybody else. Everybody else in the room is native and I'm white.
Would you?
Should I be afraid?
If you lived in the city, would you lock your doors?
Probably.
Yeah, I would. I don't trust the city.
Probably. I'd probably forget to lock my car. When I go to Gallup, I lock my car. When I go to Albuquerque, I lock my car. When I stop at Walmart, I lock my car. I can assure you I lock my car. But when I stop for a hamburger and go inside, I don't lock my car. Am I crazy, Sharon? Tell me. Am I insane? Am I the insane one here? Or is it my friend? It's not really my friend. Kind of a jackass. He's retired military. He was a tanker. He wishes that he could get himself a tank. Really? You want a tank? You want to be able to blow people up from a mile away? Yeah. He wants a tank. He was in the Marines for a tour, and then he joined the Army. Now he's a tank, or he was a tanker, he's not anymore. But he's got guns all over the place. My brother has guns all over the place. Of course, he lives in South Carolina. It's the most dangerous state in the Union. That's where my brother is. But who is my brother afraid of? So which one of us is crazy? Am I crazy for not locking my back door? I got 2 dogs. People usually don't. And they're really nice. I don't know if you're good. Well, you've been around my dogs. The beige one and the black and white one. You know, they run around all the time. They never bite anybody. So Sherry, am I the crazy one? Are you sure? My wife lives out in the middle of Iowa. She lives in the middle of a cornfield. She's not armed either. She doesn't have a gun. But I wouldn't get too close to her. She has the ability to kill people, which kind of scares me sometimes. Anyway, okay. There are 2 concerns associated with mental health courts. The participants may feel coerced into participating, and of course that's kind of unnecessary. The second concern involves the selection of participants, the gender and the racial bias. There is gender and racial bias as far as these mental health courts. Guess who gets to go to mental health courts instead of going to prison? White males. Now, after this weekend, it looks like that's pretty damn smart, because the guy that shot up the synagogue was 57, I think. The guy with the pipe bombs was 56. And the guy that shot up or attacked the black people at the Kroger's was 54. So 50-year-old white guys seem to be the most dangerous people in the United States right now. I had a friend who said that he would do anything to see that Barack Obama wasn't elected president the second time. He said he would do and say anything to keep Barack Obama from being elected president. He hated black people. He had a sawed-off shotgun, which was illegal, underneath his car seat. Of course, he was a policeman as well. Now, this is kind of scary. This guy was a cop, and he served as a cop for about 25 years. And he hated black people. That was kind of interesting. While he was in the Air Force, he couldn't do anything about it. But after he got out, he could be as prejudiced as he wanted to be. And he did. He said some horrible, horrible things. He was buried with a watch, a Slick Willie watch, that was anti-Bill Clinton. They used to call Bill Clinton Slick Willie. The Republicans did, right? Really interesting fellow. I wish he was alive today so that I could ask. He's the one that died of a heart attack last year. I wish he was alive today so I could ask him about these three people that have just come to the fore. The one that hated the Jews, the one that hated the black people, and the one that hated Democrats. I wish I could ask him about it, because this is kind of scary. Now, it may be that 99.9% of all conservatives are okay. It's that 0.1% that seems to be coming out of the woodwork. This is really kind of scary stuff. And like I said, I don't have a gun. But what if they stopped a group of elderly, these were people out of the nursing home. They were African Americans, and they were on a bus to go vote, and they made them get off the bus and walk to the polling place, which was about a mile and a half away. These are old people. They had no respect for their age. And I'm not used to that. We should respect our elders. Don't you guys respect your elders here on the reservation?
When did that happen in the Boston?
It happened last month. They were early voting. Early voting has already started taking place. So but they aren't allowed to count the votes yet. We won't start counting the votes until election day. But we have early voting all over the United States. Is going on all over the United States. Okay, so the point is that there does seem to be a gender and a racial bias, and the racial bias is toward white people. But then again, after this weekend, it looks like maybe that bias, that racial bias, is necessary. Maybe it's white people that are the craziest people in the United States. Maybe. That's what Trump said this weekend. He said, "Oh, this isn't a gun issue. This is a mental health issue." Good. Let's argue that it's a mental health issue, but it's a mental health issue among white people, obviously, since those are all of the shooters have been white. The guy that shot remember the baseball game? They were having baseball practice, Republican baseball practice, and the guy came with a high-powered rifle and started shooting people. Remember that? He almost killed one guy. He didn't kill him, but he wounded him very severely. He was white, and he was in his 50s. So we have 50 people white guys in their 50s are shooting people up, carrying around lots of guns and lots of ammunition. Homeless courts are designed to reach out to marginalized individuals, addressing the underlying problems that resulted in their homelessness, and reintegrate these people into society. These courts are typically held in shelters or agencies that serve this population. I'm still confused as to what's wrong with Jewish people. I can't get a good answer. I know the history. I understand the history. And I understand the rationale. But it just still doesn't make any sense.
Maybe because they wear scarves.
They were, I'm sorry.
They wear the way they dress.
They were forced to dress in different clothes so that people could pick them out. When they were in Germany, they were forced to wear a Star of David. One of the interesting things that happened this weekend, the Pittsburgh Steelers changed the logo on their helmet. They have a yellow star, they have a black star, and a red star, is that right? They have three different, is it blue? Anyway, they changed the yellow star to the Star of David. Star of David, of course, has 6 points. The star that they had 4 points. So they changed it to the Star of David, showing solidarity with the Jewish community in Pittsburgh, because that's where the shooting took place on Saturday. And they changed their helmets on Sunday. I wonder if this will become permanent. Should be interesting to see if that's what happens. Anyway, we're still confused about this. Do you guys hate Jews? Does anybody know anybody that's Jewish? Nice guy?
Are they
Bad guy?
different?
Something's wrong with that person? No. You can tell them from everybody else because of the way they act, the way they talk, the way they smell, the way they, I don't know. No. Do they look like me? No. They're taller. Of course, everybody's taller.
They're darker.
Sorry?
They look Hispanic.
No, they're darker complexion. Some of them are darker complexion. That's pretty. Black
I
pretty.
wouldn't tell.
Unless they're in a synagogue and then you just shoot everybody, I guess. That's the way it works. That's one of the reasons why the Germans had to put stars of David's on people, so that they could tell the difference between the good guys and the bad guys, or what they considered bad guys. This is Nazis doing it, just before World War II. Then they rounded them all up and tried to kill them all. It's one of the reasons why there are so few Jewish people in Germany today. As irritating as that is. Rather than being fined or taken into custody, participants in homeless courts are given alternative sentences, including assignment to programs and activities, employment training, potentially counseling of one kind or another, Alcoholics Anonymous meetings and homeless shelters, and volunteer work, just to get them working again, just to give them something to do. I go crazy on the weekends because I have nothing to do. Of course, I'm watching football now, or football on Saturdays. I don't really watch professional football. I watch college football. And my wife's team won this weekend, and my team won this weekend. They both were somewhat upsets. Her team beat Florida, and my team beat the #1 team in their conference. So now, my team is #1 team in the conference. Yeah, well, they're tied for first with 2 other teams. So we'll see what happens. Domestic violence courts. In recent years, domestic violence courts have coordinated efforts to hold perpetrators accountable, enhance victim and child safety, and promote informed judicial decision-making. Yay. Domestic violence courts differ from other specialty courts. They start from the premise that the offender's behavior is learned rather than rooted in a treatable addiction or illness. In other words, this is learned behavior. They learned it from somebody. Now they need to treat them. Now they need to change their behavior. The court proceedings are primarily adversarial rather than therapeutic. So it's him against her, or him against him if it's a gay relationship, or her against her, of course, which we see far less. Both victim and perpetrators express satisfaction with the court processes and outcomes. Perpetrators are more likely to comply with judge-ordered conditions since they aren't going to be incarcerated. In a lot of states, and we've discussed this before, but in a lot of states, if there is a domestic violence situation, both parties are arrested and put in jail for the night. The cooling off period, they call it. The problem is, of course, if they have children, then they have to either find somebody to take care of the children, or they have to put them in foster care. And they certainly don't want to put somebody in foster care. But they arrest both parties, both the male and the female. Because very often, in more than half of the cases, it's the female that is the aggressor in more than half of the cases. And a lot of men won't admit that because they don't want to admit that they've been whacked away on by their small little spouse. I felt the same way. My wife was only 5'1". She only weighed over 100 pounds whenever she was pregnant. So the rest of the time, she's just a skinny, tiny little thing. And here she is dumping boiling water on my head, hitting me with a baseball bat. Well, you know the stabbing part. But I'm a big guy. I mean, I'm bigger than that. I'm bigger than she was. And I outweighed her by 30 or 40 pounds, usually. So if it gotten into a fist fight where both of us were actually swinging, then I probably would have won. That's why she had instruments of torture or instruments of destruction. Community courts are a neighborhood-focused court that is designed to address local problems such as vandalism, prostitution, shoplifting, and vagrancy. Vagrancy, of course, is what they usually charge the homeless people with. The fact that they don't have a job, they're just sitting around, and potentially they look like they might potentially cause trouble. They might steal something, or they're casing it someplace in order to survive. Participants generally like how they are treated in these courts. They usually use alternative sanctions. They feel that they are being treated more fairly than in a traditional court, where they're treated like a criminal. In community courts, they're not really treated that way. They're treated as a citizen, and you are a functioning citizen, and therefore they will give you something to do, or there will be some kind of reparation, and you won't have to go to jail. This is something relatively new. Veterans courts. In a typical veterans court, a district attorney may opt to defer prosecution or offer a plea bargain to a reduced charge if it is clear that the offense was related to the veteran's disability. And usually that disability is PTSD. That's the one that is stated more frequently than others. When did we first discover PTSD? It's always been around, but we called it different things. Until Vietnam. Then we saw so much of it. About a third of the people that fought in the war were diagnosed with PTSD. 1 out of every 3 people. And it was mostly because the individuals in that war were draftees. A lot of them were draftees. So we didn't see it as much with the Marines because they were all volunteer, or at least in the beginning they were all volunteer. Then we started drafting people into the Marines. We didn't see it as much in the Navy because they were all volunteers. We didn't see it nearly as much in the Air Force as we did in the Army. It was the Army that we're drafting people into. But when I was drafted in 1971. We were drafting into three of the 4 branches of service. They're drafting into the Marines, the Army, and the Air Force. And actually they were drafting more people in the Air Force at that time because they were planning on kicking up the air war. Of course, we didn't realize that at the time. So I joined the Air Force. If you're drafted, you only have to serve 2 years active duty. If you're volunteer, you have to serve 4 or 6. If you volunteer to join the Navy, it's a 6-year commitment. Actually, it's an 8-year commitment with 6 years active duty. But in the Air Force, it was only a 4-year commitment, active duty commitment with a 6-year total commitment. As strange as that may seem, why am I talking about this? Because we're talking about PTSD. So a lot of the guys coming out of the Army from Vietnam, if we broke it down into branches of the service, it'd be closer to half of the Army guys were suffering from PTSD. Now, when did we discover PTSD? Vietnam War was from 1963 until 1975. Second longest war we've ever had. Longest war we've ever had is in Afghanistan. It's going on right now. So when did we first start diagnosing people with PTSD? As it turns out, it was not until the 1980s. As horrible as that is. So we had all these guys coming back from Vietnam. We had all these guys suffering from all these problems, and a lot of them were incarcerated for domestic violence. They were incarcerated for vagrancy. They were incarcerated for drug use. And we didn't know what their problem was until the 1980s. And we finally came up with the diagnosis. The problem was, so we've got all these veterans coming back from Vietnam suffering from PTSD. So what do we do with them? Well, if they're busted, if there's something wrong with them, shouldn't we help them? How many people think we should help them if they come back, if we have a veteran coming back from war with a problem? I got 1, 2, 3. Everybody? Is it okay? Let's help them all, right? Cost money. All right, so there we go. We're trying to fight a war, and here we are. We've got the people coming back, and they're screaming that they've got a problem. So let's ignore the problem and pretend that there is no problem. That's a lot, unfortunately, in Vietnam. So we had a lot of guys that ended up in jail. Okay, so then in the 1980s, after the war was over with, and we had a new president. Who was our new president? Oh, it was Ronald Reagan. Yeah, and he went to the all-volunteer army. I don't know if you remember when. Well, nobody's old enough to remember Ronald Reagan and his all-volunteer army. But he went to an all-volunteer army, and after that he said, we're going to help the veterans. And so he started pumping a little bit of money into mental health for veterans. And of course, by this time, a lot of these guys had committed suicide. When did 57,000 men died in Vietnam, over 57,000 men. We passed 57,000 suicides in 2008, I think. 2008 to 2009. Of Vietnam vets committing suicide. And a lot of that happened because they didn't get any treatment. They just didn't get any treatment. And people didn't understand them. They were trying to dissipate all their problems, and they did it through drugs and alcohol, unfortunately. A lot of them drank themselves to death. A lot of them just killed themselves. It's a lot easier that way the pain goes away immediately. It's all gone. If you drink, you have to stay drunk in order to not feel pain, but as soon as you get sober or don't have enough money to buy alcohol, now you got the problems coming back. So we had a lot of suicides, to the extent that they passed 57,000 Vietnam veterans' suicides. So how many people are we talking about? Well, the answer is 8 million. There were 8 million men in uniform during Vietnam, those 12 years of Vietnam. So that's what we're talking about. So a lot of these guys are suffering from PTSD. And of course, if the veteran goes to this court, they have to agree that they will seek the treatment that the judge tells them they have to seek. Offenders who are diverted to Veterans Court are less likely to reoffend than those whose cases go through the traditional criminal justice system. A lot of times it's because they go back to their military roots, whatever roots those happen to be. Even if they were a draftee, they hated the military, a lot of times just being around other veterans is enough. One of the things that we discovered after Vietnam was the individuals that stayed in the service, the individuals that were around other military people who had experienced very similar things, these individuals didn't suffer from PTSD until they got out of the service. And that's one of the reasons why after World War II, there were so few people that had any problems with these types of mental problems, this type of mental illness. The reason was because they joined military organizations. They joined the AMVETS. They joined the VFW. They joined other veterans groups so that they could sit and talk about stuff. And they did. It's really kind of interesting. I don't really join these kinds of organizations, but my wife's a member of the VFW. So we went over for a pancake breakfast or a pork lunch or something. I don't know. Anyway, so I'm sitting there, and all of a sudden these guys kind of sit down around me, and they start talking. You know how guys are. They're trying to one-up each other. And so they started talking. And my stories were just as good as their stories were. I know. And they said, you ought to join this organization. But I don't join organizations. I'm not a joiner. I try to stay away from that stuff. Anyway. Maybe if I did, I could tolerate mutton. Nah, that's never going to happen. One concern is that specialty courts are presided over by middle-class judges. So these are criticisms of problem-solving courts. One concern is that specialty courts are presided over by middle-class judges who reflect middle-class values and who may become inappropriately paternalistic in what they require of people. Middle-class judges. Some have argued that problem-solving courts lack legitimacy because threatening punishment to coerce rehabilitation is unfair and because guilt or innocence is not determined by a trial. They just assume your guilt. But usually they drop the charges. But they assume you're guilty. Prosecutors feel pressure to favor rehabilitation of the offender over protection of society, and defenders feel pressured to plead their clients guilty and to inform the court of client's failure to comply with the terms of probation. And this is kind of a problem. This is especially a problem. If we've got an individual it's a drug court, and this guy's a supplier, then he's going to want to go to drug court because he's not going to have to serve any time. He's going to have to do community service or something. And of course, he's on probation, and if you're on probation, you can't have a gun. If you're on probation, you can't be around people who are known criminals. That's what probation is. And if you are, you lose your probation. They'll throw you back in jail, or they'll throw you in jail. And of course, with drug courts, we don't see that. So a lot of individuals who are actually very serious bad guys, these individuals go to drug courts and they're able to get off pretty much scot-free. Researchers worry about the lack of rigorous empirical studies that assess how specialty courts influence or fail to influence offenders' conduct. And of course, there is no research out there. There's a different court. Different courts, of course, have different recidivism rates. And because of that, it's very difficult to determine whether this is good or whether this is bad. And then we have a portion of the population that doesn't like specialty courts, the problem-solving courts. They want everybody thrown into jail. I know. What's wrong with those people? They think all crimes should be punished, and they think everybody should get to go to jail if they've committed a crime. So, and we're hearing about them now. Of course, we're listening to all these political ads on television. If you're listening to those political ads on television, and there's always one group that wants to rid the world of crime. There's an advertisement against Xochitl Torres Small, and that's not really the way to pronounce her first name, by the way. I know it's Spanish. It's not Spanish. Spanish doesn't have any X's. So if you see an X in the name, it's not a Spanish name. It's an Indian name. Xochitl. And that's, of course. So if you're in Europe and you see an X in a Spanish name, you know that the lady is not Spanish, she's Basque. And if it's somebody from Mexico and there's an X in her name, you know that her name is not Spanish. You know that it's probably one of the native languages. Anyway, Xochitl Torres Small, they said that she's weak on crime and that she wants to release all the criminals from prison. It's one of the advertisements. And of course, she has an advertisement that says, no. She believes that we need to protect our country. They also said that she wants to open up the border for any immigrants that wants to come in. And of course, she said, that's not true. That's just not true. So then she corrected the record by saying what she really believed in. It should be interesting to see if she wins. I think she's ahead. I think she is, if I'm not mistaken. So she's supposed to win. They had an ad about Nancy Pelosi, and Xochitl Torres Small is like Nancy Pelosi's best friend, as it turns out. Who would have thought? The two ladies don't even know each other. As curious as that is. And I get to watch. I'm having such a good time watching New Mexico politics.
And that's the channels we get, right?
Those are the only channels I get. I have cable. I have Dish. Or is it? Yeah, I think I have Dish. What have I done? Oh, no. Right. Forensic assessment in juvenile criminal court cases. Forensic assessment activities are typically performed by clinical psychologists. The field has prospered in the last 30 years, mainly because there are people that seem to be crazy and people that we need to determine whether they have a mental illness or not. Forensic psychology is recognized as a specialty by the American Board of Professional Psychology and by the APA, the American Psychological Association. So they recognize forensic psychology. This is something that Dr. Phil did. He was a forensic psychologist. He was a jury consultant, and he was a forensic psychologist. But he didn't really work with forensics nearly as much as he worked with jury consulting. So I think it's on tonight. Bull is on tonight. So if you want to watch a jury consultant in action, Bull is a jury consultant. And the show was actually written by Dr. Phil. So that's kind of exciting in itself. Dr. Phil is from Oklahoma. That's why he has such a strange accent. It's not quite Texas, it's not quite Southern, it's kind of somewhere in between. The revised specialty guidelines for the practice of forensic psychology have been approved. Forensic psychology pre-doctoral training concentrations and postdoctoral fellowships are available, providing formal training in the field. Now, if you want to be does anybody want to be a forensic psychologist? This is profiling. This has to do with profiling. It's not as much fun as it sounds, okay? It's pretty ugly, right? I mean, you get to hear, you learn about all the aspects of the case. A lot of the aspects of the case are kind of strange, pretty gory, potentially. The policeman that went in to the synagogue, evidently this guy, he didn't just shoot people, he shot people a lot in the head, to the extent that they couldn't determine. And it's one of the reasons why it took them so long to identify all the people. Because he shot away their faces, as strange as that may seem. And one of the things he said when he was in custody was that he hated Jews and he wanted them all to die. He wanted all Jews to die. And of course, where did they take him? To a Jewish hospital where he was treated by Jewish doctors, Jewish nurses, and anyway. And they saved his life, actually. He was bleeding to death. And they saved his life. So, I don't know. Would you have done that? Would you have saved his life, this guy who just shut up a synagogue? If you were Jewish, would you have done that? It's tough. I was working in Lubbock, Texas. I was in the Air Force. I got in trouble. I didn't salute this guy. So he was going to give me a reprimand. I was going to lose his strength. So this was on, I don't know, Friday. And on the weekend, guess who came into the hospital? It wasn't him, it was his son. His son came in. This was during the 1970s when guys, especially high school kids, were wearing really, really tight pants. And of course, they weren't expanding pants like you guys have today. These were blue jeans that they were wearing really, really tight. And so they were trying to... Anyway, his pants were so tight. How tight were they? They were so tight that they had strangulated one of his testicles. So it had cut off the circulation to that testicle, twisted it around, and now it was dead. I know. And he came into the hospital, and I saw his name, and I had to draw this kid's blood. For surgery, emergency surgery. Now his dad had just laid me on the carpet and had screamed at me for 30 minutes. I mean, it was probably not 12 hours before. And here I've got his son is on my table, and I've got to draw his blood for surgery. I had to cross-match blood for that kid's surgery. I had to cross-match blood for this kid's surgery. And I had to draw his blood. I saw his name, boy, and I was pissed. I was angry at this. He's going to take a stripe away from me. He's going to cut my income by one stripe. Bastard. For not saluting. No, it's something so simple. And I had his son right there on the table. And his son had this. His veins weren't very good. He had upside down veins, which means that instead of having really good veins in his antecubital area, his veins are right here. And they're really hard to draw because for one thing you have to hyperextend the elbow and you have to draw them. And it's dangerous down in there. You're not really supposed to be around in there very much. So it was a tough stick. But I'm really good at phlebotomy, and I got that kid's blood first time, no sweat. I did it. I went ahead and drew his blood, and I hesitated for a nanosecond, and then I said, I don't care about this guy. He can take all the stripes away from me. I'm not going to screw up this kid's blood just to pay him back. That's just not right. It was the last question I ever had in my mind about how you treat people in the hospital. Anyway, I went ahead and drew his blood, and he was there. He was in the room. And of course, when he saw me, I mean, he had just reamed me out 12 hours before, and his face just turned ashen white, so pale, as pale as that whiteboard there. I mean, because one thing, he didn't like needles, and the other thing was he was afraid I was going to butcher his son. But I didn't. I got his blood that quick. And then the nurse came in to start an IV. She couldn't find a vein. And guess who stuck that vein? I did. Yeah, I started his IV for him. And she said, I never would have looked there for a vein. It was under here. So usually you start veins on top of their arm or on the inside of their arm. His are underneath. His veins are upside down. Anyway, I started. And guess what happened? I didn't lose a stripe. I didn't lose a stripe. So what are we doing? We're doing formal training. The research and clinical literature on forensic practice has increased dramatically. Now we have a lot more information. We're getting a lot more profiling information. That's the first thing they talked about with the guy that shot up Kroger, with the guy that shot up the synagogue in Pittsburgh. They started talking about the forensic aspect of his potential mental illness. I don't know if you were listening, you were watching the news, but Donald Trump called for he wants to execute this guy. He wants to shoot him. He doesn't want to shoot him. He just wants to execute him. He said, we need to bring back the death penalty. Okay. That doesn't prejudice any court, do you think? We'll see what happens. Is it a federal crime? shooting up a synagogue in Pittsburgh. Is it a federal crime?
Yes.
It is? What kind of a federal crime? What law did he break?
Going into a church.
I'm sorry?
Going into a church.
Oh, jeez. The guy in Texas went into church, he was killed. No, you can go to churches and kill people. It's okay. Church isn't federal territory, is it?
Maybe the city, within the city limits,
No, then it's,
the town.
he's got a county court to go through, he's got a city court to go through, he's got state court to go through. What federal crime did he break?
Having a gun.
No. All of his guns were legal.
He did have a license, and
He had a license, you bet. Bought all of his guns the way he was supposed to. He didn't break any laws.
Just state license.
The state's gonna try, yeah. Not the federal court. So Donald Trump can talk all day long, it's not gonna make any difference. He doesn't have anything to do with this case. However, sometimes presidents do get involved in this stuff. Remember the Terry Schiavo case in Florida. The governor was George Bush's brother, and the governor decided that that the parents should be allowed to keep Terry Schiavo alive. The husband wanted to pull the plug on Terry Schiavo. And of course, the state of Florida, their laws say that it's the husband that has a responsibility for that individual.
No, if
Not the parents.
If the church was on a military grounds, that would have been federal.
Well, it's federal, yeah, but it wasn't. It's a synagogue. I don't think we have any synagogues on any military reservations.
I only said federal because Trump was being involved.
Well, you can get involved all he wants, but the reality is that it's a state. I mean, he broke state laws. The only law that he broke that was a federal law was a hate crimes law. But he's not going to be tried. They're not going to try him for hate crimes unless he's exonerated somehow. I don't know how they're going to do that. But, anyway, he didn't break any federal laws. So despite the fact that Trump wants to execute him, Trump has nothing to do with what's going to happen with this guy. Nothing at all. And some states don't have the death penalty. Only select states have the death penalty. And I don't think Pennsylvania is one of them. So that should be interesting to see what happens. The guy that shot up the black church in South Carolina, he was given the death penalty. That kid was given the death penalty. He was only 19. Not very old. Okay, what's happening? Growth in the field is likely to continue, and the reason it's going to continue is because mental health experts may have expertise in a variety of areas relevant to litigation, and of course this litigation that we're talking about has to do with profiling. It has to do with the profiling, and I told you about the one case that I got involved with Jubert in Omaha. I profiled in one way, and the actual profiler profiled him completely differently. And as it turned out, I was right. The only thing I was right about was the fact that he was a military kid. The law permits and even encourages the use of expert testimony on psychological topics. So usually what they will do, the prosecution will find their set of forensic psychologists, and the defense will find theirs. And usually they just argue back and forth, and they get to decide, the jury has to decide whether it's the defense psychologist that's correct or the prosecuting attorney that's correct. Expert testimony by forensic psychologists thrives because it can be very lucrative. And so there are a lot of psychologists that wander around the country testifying. And they can make lots and lots of money. And they can travel, which a lot of people like to travel. So there you go. You can go from one place to the other. I had a friend that was a traveling nurse. He just loved it. He had a great time traveling around, trying to seduce women. He was a terrible person, but he had a good time. As long as he had a good time, I mean, that's all that's important. And he was a nurse. In general, and he was big. He was strong. So they would hire him, and he would go in. And a lot of nursing has to do with movement, moving your patients. You got to roll them over and pick them up. And he was really strong. So and he was tall. He was really tall. So he had the leverage. So he was good at picking people up and moving them. A lot of times they have to get a lift to lift the patient up if they're too big, and he was able to do that. So he was a very successful nurse. People loved him. And he's funny. He's just a funny guy. Everybody likes somebody that's funny. Everybody's looking for a funny nurse. There we go. We need more nurses that wear clown faces. In general, a qualified expert can testify about a topic if such testimony is relevant to an issue in dispute, and if the usefulness of the testimony outweighs whatever prejudicial impact it might have. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled in 1993 case of Daubert versus Merrill Dow that federal judges can decide whether an expert testimony has a sufficiently relevant and reliable scientific foundation to be admitted into evidence. Daubert versus Merrill Dow. Merrill Dow is a company. It's a chemical company, Merrill Dow. And they had to decide whether the psychologist had the expertise to make that determination. And of course, the Supreme Court found with the psychologist. One of the most controversial cases of competence to stand trial and the insanity plea was the case of Andrea Yates. You may remember this lady. She was down in Houston, Texas. Yates had a long history of depression and had been diagnosed as psychotic after her fourth child. Normally, postpartum psychosis means that the individual wants to kill their child. And that's usually what happens with these individuals. They are not incarcerated, but they are hospitalized. They can't let them close to their children. My mother used to talk about this. My mother was not a psychiatric nurse, but she was a nurse starting in the 1930s. She used to talk about postpartum psychosis from time to time. We had a cousin, evidently she had a cousin, who suffered from postpartum psychosis. And first time they let the lady have the baby, she dropped it on the floor and flattened one side of its head. Of course, it was a newborn baby, so everything was fine. But they took the baby away from the mother, they put her in a mental hospital, and she stayed there the rest of her life. One of the things that happens to you when you have a baby, you've got lots of hormones that are changing back and forth. You have neurotransmitters, odd neurotransmitters that are being activated in your brain. Oxytocin is one of them. And for somebody with postpartum psychosis, a lot of times they never go back to normal. So they have to be hospitalized for the rest of their life. Or in the old days, that's what they did. I had a guy that was working for me. Where was I? I was in Omaha. He was a Mormon from Idaho, and his wife was pregnant, and everybody was so happy. Everybody was so happy. And I met the lady a couple times before when she was pregnant, and I thought, wow, this is the darkest faced person that I have ever met who's pregnant. She didn't smile. She didn't. If you tried to get her to laugh, you couldn't get her to laugh. I mean, this lady was not happy, and I saw that, and I asked him about it. He said, since she got pregnant, she's just not. I can't make her. There's nothing I can do to make her happy. She's reading all these really odd novels. There's really strange stuff going on, and I told him, let's see what happens, but. She seems like she's a little bit depressed. I said, yeah, you gotta watch her after she has the baby. And that's what happened. She tried to drop the baby right after she had it. And of course, he's Mormon, so they like to have kids. And here, this lady she went into psychosis. He had to raise the baby by himself. We only worked together for about 6 more months, and then he went back to Idaho to open up a dental practice. He was a dental student. And he took his wife with him, but she had to travel in a different car. Her parents had to come down and pick her up because they couldn't let her anywhere close to that baby because they were afraid that she was going to kill her. So when they took her, she was in a mental hospital in Omaha while she was in Omaha, and then they transported her to Idaho. She tried to, there's a Snake River Bridge. I don't know if has anybody ever been to, okay, it's really tall. You know, and people take pictures of it all the time. You're on the side of the cliff. She tried to jump off the Snake River Bridge. I had to catch her before she didn't make it. As sad as all that is, that's the last I heard of the two of them. She was still couldn't have contact with the baby. She was fairly suicidal. It's a really strange situation. So this is very real. This psychotic things that psychotic episodes that some women don't go into postpartum depression or the baby blues. They go into a psychosis, and that seems to be what happened with Andrea Yates. Another time, I had a student in one of my classes, a little tiny thing. She used to sit in the back of the room, and I have a hearing loss at a certain frequency, and she used to sit behind people and talk in that frequency, and I couldn't hear her. And she'd say the most horrible things about me, sitting in the back of the room. And this is while she was pregnant. She was just a tiny little thing, and she got huge. I mean, she got gigantic because, well, she's only a little bitty thing, and her husband was big, and so her baby was fairly large, 7.5 pounds or something like that. Anyway, so she finally gives birth to this baby, and then she writes this poem, and it's about holding the baby, and she left it on her seat. She left it on her seat. So I found it. I saw that piece of paper, I found it, and it was a poem about killing the child. So I told her friend that this is a possibility. That she wrote a poem, and I think she was trying to communicate. And of course, this is in the military. We were on a military base, and so I told the friend, and the friend told the husband, and the husband told the doctor, and the doctor brought her in. And of course, normally with these, you know, it's a postpartum. They see the patient for postpartum appointment. The lady hardly ever says anything. I mean, they say, "Well, how are you feeling?" "Oh, fine." You know, so "oh, fine" is the only thing they get to say. But this time he did a complete mental health evaluation on her, and he started her on antidepressants, which potentially saved everything. She stopped saying things behind people. My hearing loss is at a relatively high frequency, so you have to talk way up here in order for me not to be able to hear. Anyway, she stopped doing that in the room. It was really kind of interesting. Or sad. Let's call it sad. Anyway, she didn't kill her baby. I was scared. And it was a male baby, so I know. As strange as this may sound, male babies are killed more frequently than female babies, for some reason. And I have no idea why. Sure I do, I know why. But we're not going to talk about it. She'd gone into psychosis after her 4th child. She had a history of attempted suicide, and this had been going on since high school. Here she has 4 kids, right? 4 boys, and she's got a problem. So finally, So they were told by the doctor, don't have any more babies. But they were of this they were of a religious order or a religious group that wanted them to have as many babies as they possibly could. So 10 months later, she had another baby, despite the fact the doctor told them not to get her to get pregnant. And she told her husband she didn't want another baby, but he got her pregnant anyway. She She wasn't allowed to use birth control. I don't know. Who's in charge of reproduction? Anyway, she had another baby 10 months later. And when that little girl was 6 months old, she drowned all 5 of her children. All 5 of them. She drowned them in the bathtub. I don't know how, if you guys have ever tried to hold somebody down to drown somebody, but it's not the easiest thing in the world. It takes a while. I used to trap. I trapped muskrat. And we had to hold those suckers under the water to drown them. Of course, it's a muskrat. So muskrats are a little bit different than humans. But it took sometimes 5 minutes to drown that damn muskrat. I had a friend that would, he always took a club with him. So hit him up, and just about beat him to death, then they'd drown. But I'm not that vicious. I just drowned them. I guess which was worse. I don't know which is worse. Anyway, I was after the pelt, okay? That's my money. That was my money. That's how I grew up, needing money. Anyway, so she drowned all 5 of her children. Sadly, as sad as that is, we're almost done. Yates was found competent to stand trial and was convicted of 5 counts of murder. The jury rejected the death penalty, so they weren't going to execute her, they were going to put her in prison for life. Upon appeal, the trial was thrown out and Yates was retried. She was found not guilty by reason of insanity. So the first time she was found guilty, the second time she was found not guilty by reason of insanity. She was remanded to a mental institution in Vernon, Texas. Now, the strange thing about that is I used to teach at Vernon Regional Junior College. I didn't teach Andrea Yates. I didn't have anything to do with her. It just seems odd that she went to the same place where I used to teach.
She lives today.
Yeah, she's still alive. They put her in with other women who killed their children. As interesting as that is, she is still alive. And she seems relatively sane. The reason she seems relatively sane is because she's not taking care of children. She's not around children. As odd as that may seem. Anyway, Andrea Yates and I were at the same place, not at the same time. She was after. I taught at Vernon. Anyway, she was from Houston, Texas, and drowned all of her babies, which is a hint and a warning. I'm not. Babies are a blessing, every damn single one of them. But the reality is that some women can't handle it. And it's a tiny, tiny percentage of women can't handle that many pregnancies. Obviously, she was one of them. So.
I have a niece she has postpartum depression.
Okay.
All the child